Rain fell on the metal roofs of Ashgate, and the whole colony smelled of wet dust and fear. Grant Bellwether stood near the front gate with his boots sinking into the mud, watching the sky. Something was coming, and everyone already knew what it was. Word had spread through the colony faster than the storm clouds. The Cathari were on their way. For 3 years, Ashgate had lived on the edge of Cathari space, a small human settlement built on a planet nobody important had ever bothered to name properly. It was called simply Ashgate, after the gray ash-colored soil that covered the hills around it. The colonists were farmers, engineers, and a handful of soldiers who had no real hope of defending anything if the Cathari decided to attack. The Dominion had conquered 12 star systems in the last 100 years, and every single one of those conquests had begun the same way. A fleet appearing in the sky, followed by silence, followed by surrender or slaughter. Grant was not a soldier. He was an engineer who had been given the unlucky job of colony liaison, which meant that whenever anyone official showed up, human or otherwise, he was the one who had to stand in front and speak first. He didn't feel brave. He felt like a man standing in the rain waiting for a wave to knock him down. Beside him stood Captain Elias Cade, the head of Ashgate's tiny defense force, which consisted of 40 soldiers, a handful of outdated turrets, and not much else. Cade had his arms crossed and his jaw tight. "They're not here to talk," he said quietly. "The Cathari don't send warships to talk." "They send warships to threaten," Grant said. "Then they talk. That's how it usually goes." "And if the talking doesn't work?" Grant didn't answer. He didn't need to. High above the clouds, a shape began to grow. It was not a small shape. The Cathari flagship descended slowly, filling more and more of the gray sky until it blocked out the light entirely, casting a long shadow over the fields and homes of Ashgate. Smaller ships broke away from it, dropping toward the colony in formation, engines glowing like small red eyes in the storm. Children were pulled inside by their parents. Dogs barked and then went quiet. The whole colony seemed to hold its breath at once. Inside the flagship, far above the fear on the ground, General Roskin stood on the command deck with his claws folded behind his back, watching the human colony grow larger on the viewscreen. He was a tall Cathari, built like a soldier who had spent his whole life proving himself in battle, with pale gray skin and eyes the color of a dying star. He did not like this mission. He did not like humans, and he especially did not like being sent to merely inspect a colony that, in his opinion, should have already been burned to the ground. "They have no fleet," Roskin said to the officer beside him. "No shields worth mentioning. A single strike could end this before nightfall." "The king has not given that order," the officer replied carefully. Roskin's eyes narrowed. "The king gives many orders I do not understand." At the far end of the command deck, seated on a raised chair that was more practical than ceremonial, King Doran Voss listened to every word without turning his head. He was a king who had earned his crown through war, not birth, and he carried the marks of that war across his body, scars that no healer had ever fully erased, because he had refused to let them. Doran was broad and heavy with muscle, his skin a darker shade of gray than most of his soldiers, and his eyes carried a tiredness that few of his people ever saw, because he made sure they never saw it. He had ruled the Cathari Dominion for 11 years. In that time, he had never once bowed to another living being. Kneeling among his people was not a gesture of respect. It was a gesture of surrender, reserved only for the moment before death. A king who knelt was a king who was finished. Doran had made sure, through blood and fire, that such a moment would never come for him. "Why do we not simply take the colony, my king?" Roskin asked, his patience thinning. "The humans cannot stop us. They never could." Doran finally turned his head, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Because I want to see them first," he said. "Not their weapons, not their walls, them." Roskin said nothing more, though his silence carried disagreement in every line of his posture. Down below, on Ashgate's muddy ground, The Cathari shuttles landed in the central square with a heavy thud that shook loose roof tiles and rattled windows. Steam hissed from their hulls. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened, and armored figures began to step out, one after another, boots striking the wet stone with the calm certainty of soldiers who had never once lost a war. Grant felt his heart pounding as he walked forward to meet them, Captain Cade close behind him. He had rehearsed a dozen speeches in his head over the last few days, and every single one of them left his mind the moment the largest figure stepped off the final shuttle. King Doran Voss walked into the square himself, and the entire colony seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his presence. He did not raise a weapon. He did not need to. His silence alone was heavier than any threat Grant could have imagined. "I am told," Doran said, his voice low and even, carrying easily across the square, "that this colony refuses to surrender, even knowing it cannot win. I have come to see for myself what kind of people would make such a foolish choice." Grant swallowed hard, forced his shoulders straight, and stepped forward to answer him. Behind the king, General Roskin's hand rested near his weapon, waiting, hopping for any excuse at all. The square stayed quiet except for the rain tapping on metal roofs and armor. Grant Bellwether stood in front of the king of the Cathari Dominion, trying to find words that wouldn't get everyone in Ashgate killed. Behind him, he could feel the whole colony watching from windows and doorways, holding their breath the way people do when they know one wrong word could end everything. "We are not foolish," Grant said carefully. "We simply have nowhere else to go. This is our home." Doran studied him for a long moment. A home can be rebuilt elsewhere. A life once ended cannot. "Maybe," Grant said, "but a home isn't just walls and dirt, it's the people in it. We won't leave them behind, even if staying is dangerous." General Roskin made a low sound of disgust behind the king, clearly unimpressed by what he saw as human sentimentality. Doran, however, said nothing, simply watching Grant with those tired, unreadable eyes, as if trying to decide whether the man in front of him was brave or simply too foolish to understand the danger he stood in. It was in that silence that something happened which no one, not even the king himself, expected. Norah Bellwether, 8 years old and far too curious for her own good, had slipped away from the small crowd gathered near the schoolhouse. She had been told a dozen times that morning to stay inside, to stay quiet, to stay away from the square. She had listened for about 10 minutes before her feet carried her toward the front of the crowd anyway, ducking between legs and elbows until she found a gap where she could see everything clearly. She saw the big alien man standing in the rain, taller than anyone she had ever seen, wrapped in dark armor that looked like it had been through 100 fights. She saw her father standing in front of him, looking small and scared, though he was trying hard not to show it. And she saw something else too, something none of the adults around her seemed to notice. Along the side of the king's armor, just below his ribs, a dark stain had spread and was slowly growing darker in the rain. Norah had seen blood before, on her father's hands after farm accidents, on Captain Cade's arm after a bad fall. This looked the same, just a lot more of it, hidden mostly by the king's armor and the shadows of the storm. Nobody else seemed to see it. The soldiers were watching for danger. The colonists were watching in fear. Her father was too busy trying to save everyone with careful words to notice a stain on the king's side. Norah didn't think about danger the way adults did. She didn't think about armies or wars or kings who never bowed to anyone. She thought about a person who was hurt and bleeding, standing in the rain and nobody helping him. Before anyone could stop her, she stepped out from the crowd. "Norah!" Grant's voice cracked with panic as he spun around, but it was already too late. His daughter was walking straight toward the king of the Cathari Dominion, a small girl in a yellow raincoat, completely unafraid, while 40 armored soldiers turned their weapons toward her all at once. "Get back!" Captain Cade shouted, lunging forward. But General Roskin's arm shot out and blocked him hard enough to nearly knock him off his feet. "Let the child come," Roskin said coldly, his eyes gleaming with something close to satisfaction, as if he expected this to be the excuse he had been waiting for. Doran raised a single hand, and every soldier froze instantly, weapons still aimed but no longer moving. The square fell into complete silence except for Norah's small footsteps splashing through puddles as she walked right up to the king and stopped in front of him, tilting her head back to look up at his face. "You're hurt," she said simply. Doran looked down at her, and for the first time in a very long while, he genuinely did not know what to say. No one had spoken to him that way in years. Not his advisors, not his generals, not even his own family long ago. Everyone who spoke to him chose their words carefully, weighing every syllable against the danger of angering a king who ruled through fear. Norah didn't weigh anything. She simply reached into the pocket of her raincoat and pulled out a folded square of cloth, one she had been using to wrap a scraped knee earlier that morning, and held it up toward him. "My mom says pressing on it helps," she said. "It stops the bleeding." Behind her, the entire square seemed frozen in disbelief. Grant looked as though his heart might stop completely. Roskin's hand tightened around his weapon, waiting for the king to strike the child down for such an insult, for treating him like a wounded animal instead of a ruler. But Doran did not move to strike her. He looked down at the small folded cloth in her outstretched hand, then at her face, calm and open and utterly without fear, and something old and buried deep inside him stirred, something he had not felt in a very long time. Slowly, carefully, King Doran Voss lowered himself down onto one knee in front of the girl, bringing his face level with hers, and allowed her to press the cloth gently against the wound hidden beneath his armor. The entire square stood in stunned silence. Soldiers who had marched through a dozen conquered worlds without blinking now stared in open disbelief at their king, kneeling in the mud before a human child, letting her tend to a wound he had hidden even from his own healers. For a moment nobody moved at all. Word of what happened in Ashgate Square spread through the Cathari flagship faster than any official report could travel. By the time King Doran Voss returned to the ship, soaked from the rain and quiet in a way his officers rarely saw, half the crew had already heard some version of the story, each one stranger than the last. A human child had touched the king. The king had knelt. Nobody quite believed it until they saw the look on General Roskin's face, twisted with something between disgust and disbelief. Doran said nothing about it during the flight up. He sat alone in his private quarters, the folded cloth Norah had given him still resting in his hand, now stiff and dry. He turned it over slowly between his fingers, studying it as though it might explain itself if he looked at it long enough. Counselor Yara Set found him there an hour later. She was the closest thing Doran had to a trusted advisor, an older Cathari woman who had served 3 different rulers before him and had outlived most of her enemies through patience rather than strength. She did not knock. She simply entered, as she always did, and stood in the doorway with her arms folded. "You know what they are saying," she said. "I can imagine. Some say you were showing mercy to weaken the humans' guard so they would trust us and surrender easier. Others say you were simply humoring a child so as not to frighten her." Yara paused. "And a few, the older ones, are saying something else entirely." Doran finally looked up at her. "Say it then." "They are saying you invoked the old law," Yara said carefully. "The life debt. That by kneeling before her and accepting her aid, you have bound yourself to her under the ancient code, whether you meant to or not." Doran was quiet for a long moment. The old law was something most Cathari now treated as legend, a relic from a time before the Dominion had become an empire built on conquest and fear. It said that any warrior who showed true, selfless aid to another in a moment of vulnerability, without expectation of reward, without knowledge of rank or danger, created a bond that could not be ignored. It was older than the crown itself, older than any war Doran had ever fought. "She didn't know who I was," Doran said quietly. She didn't know what I could do to her family, to her whole colony with a single word. She saw someone bleeding and she tried to help. That's all it was to her. That is precisely why the old law would apply, Yara said. The law was never about grand gestures between warriors who understood the stakes. It was about the rare, honest kindness of someone who expected nothing in return. That is what makes it sacred. Doran turned the cloth over again in his hands. Then I am bound. You may be, Yara said. Whether you choose to honor it is another matter. Meanwhile, far below on Ashgate's surface, Norah sat at the kitchen table while her mother fussed over her, checking her over for any injury, any sign that the alien soldiers had hurt her in some way. Grant sat across from her, still pale, still shaken from watching his daughter walk unafraid toward the most feared being in the entire star system. Norah, he said carefully, you cannot ever do something like that again. Do you understand me? That was the king of the Cathari Dominion. He could have. He was hurt, Dad, Norah said simply, as if this explained everything, which to her it completely did. He looked hurt and sad. Nobody was helping him. Grant opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, because there was nothing in her answer that was wrong, even if everything about the situation had been dangerous beyond anything his daughter could understand. Back aboard the flagship, General Roskin gathered a handful of his most loyal officers in a private chamber far from the command deck. His voice was low, careful, controlled in a way that made his anger even more dangerous than if he had simply shouted. Our king knelt before a human child, he said. Knelt, in front of soldiers who have bled for this empire, who have watched entire worlds burn under his orders. And now he speaks of some forgotten law as though it excuses this weakness. One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. The law is real, General, old but real. Real or not, it does not matter, Roskin snapped. A king who bows for any reason to any creature cannot lead an empire built on strength. The other systems will hear of this. They will see it as weakness, and weakness invites rebellion. He let that thought sit heavy in the room. If Doran will not protect the strength of the throne, then someone else must. No one in the room spoke against him, though a few exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they were listening to loyalty being reconsidered or treason being born. 3 days later, King Doran Voss issued an order that spread through the Dominion's chain of command and reached Ashgate by nightfall. Colony Ashgate was not to be annexed. It was not to be threatened, inspected, or approached by any Cathari vessel without his direct authorization. No explanation was given publicly, though privately, Doran knew exactly why he had given it, and he suspected Yara Set did too. Somewhere on the flagship, in a chamber far from the king's quarters, General Roskin received the same order with a tightening jaw, and a decision already forming quietly in his mind. 3 weeks passed quietly over Ashgate, though quiet was not the same as peaceful. Grant Bellwether noticed it first in small things, Cathari patrol ships passing over the colony at odd hours, flying lower and slower than usual, as though watching for something rather than simply passing through. Captain Cade noticed it too, in the strange behavior of the few Cathari soldiers still stationed near the colony's border checkpoint, who sometimes seemed to look at the humans with something close to pity rather than the usual cold indifference. Something's wrong, Cade said one evening, standing with Grant on the colony's outer wall, watching the sun sink behind the ash-colored hills. I've dealt with enough soldiers to know when men are hiding something. These Cathari are hiding something. Grant didn't disagree. He had felt it too, an unease that had settled over the colony ever since the king's strange order had arrived, protecting Ashgate without explanation. Protection from an empire that conquered everything it touched didn't come without a price, and Grant had spent every day since wondering what that price might eventually be. He didn't know that, high above the clouds, the price was already being decided by men who had never once asked his opinion on the matter. Aboard the flagship, General Roskin had spent the last 3 weeks moving carefully, gathering support among officers who shared his belief that King Doran Voss had shown weakness the entire Dominion could not afford. It was slow work, dangerous work, the kind that required patience Roskin had never enjoyed but understood was necessary. A rebellion built too quickly collapsed just as quickly. One built with careful, deliberate steps could not be stopped once it began. His plan was simple in its cruelty. A Cathari supply outpost near the border would be attacked, quietly, by soldiers loyal to Roskin disguised to look as though the assault had come from human raiders. The attack would be reported to the Dominion's high command as clear evidence that the humans of Ashgate, emboldened by the king's protection, had grown bold enough to strike Cathari territory. It would give Roskin everything he needed: a reason to remove Doran for failing to see the threat he had personally protected, and a justification to launch the full invasion of Ashgate that he had wanted from the very beginning. The attack happened on a moonless night, swift and brutal, exactly as planned. By morning, the reports had already reached King Doran Voss, twisted just enough to point directly at the humans below. Doran read the report twice, his expression unreadable, before setting it down on his desk. "You believe this?" Yara-Set asked quietly, watching him from across the room. "I believe someone wants me to believe this," Doran said. "The timing is too convenient, the evidence too clean." He looked up at her. "Roskin." Yara said nothing, which was answer enough. Down on Ashgate's surface, unaware of any of this, Norah Bellwether was doing exactly what her father had told her 100 times not to do, wandering near the colony's outer fence after dark, chasing after a small gray creature that had been living in the tall grass beyond the wall for weeks. She had named it Pebble, for reasons only she understood, and had been trying for days to coax it close enough to feed it. She didn't notice the shapes moving through the darkness beyond the fence until it was almost too late. Cathari soldiers, moving quietly under Roskin's orders, had been sent to stage a second incident near the colony itself, one meant to draw human soldiers into a confrontation that would make the fabricated attack even more believable. Norah, small and silent in the tall grass, was directly in their path. One of the soldiers spotted her first, a small human shape crouched in the darkness, and raised his weapon on instinct. Before he could fire, another soldier grabbed his arm and shoved it down hard. "Stand down," the second soldier hissed. "That is the child, the king's debt." The first soldier hesitated, clearly torn between General Roskin's orders and something deeper, older, that every Cathari soldier carried whether they admitted it openly or not. The old law was not something easily ignored, even by men following a rebellion. In the end, the soldiers pulled back into the darkness without engaging, leaving Norah crouched in the grass, completely unaware of how close she had just come to danger, still quietly calling for a small creature that had already scurried away at the first sign of movement. She didn't find out until much later how close it had truly been. By the next morning, General Roskin's carefully built plan reached its final stage. Armed with the fabricated evidence of a human attack, he called together every officer loyal to his cause and moved against the king directly, seizing control of the flagship's lower decks, while Doran was still reviewing the falsified reports in his private chambers. Alarms tore through the ship. Soldiers loyal to the crown clashed with soldiers loyal to Roskin in the corridors, the sound of weapons fire echoing through steel hallways that had never before witnessed Cathari fighting Cathari. Doran rose from his chair the moment the alarm sounded, his hand closing around the hilt of a weapon he had not needed to use in years. "It has begun," Yara said grimly, drawing her own blade. "Then let it end quickly," Doran said, and moved toward the door. Far below, on the ground, Captain Cade watched the sky above Ashgate light up with distant flashes of orbital fire, far too high and far too fast to understand what was happening, only that something enormous had just gone terribly wrong above their heads. The corridors of the flagship had become a battlefield, and King Doran Voss moved through them like a storm that had been waiting years to be released. Soldiers who had only ever seen him seated on his command chair, calm and controlled, now saw the warrior who had actually earned that chair through 11 years of brutal war. He fought without hesitation, cutting through Roskin's rebel soldiers not out of cruelty, but out of pure necessity, every strike measured and precise, the product of decades spent surviving battles most Cathari only heard about in stories. Yara Set fought beside him, older but no less dangerous, her blade moving with the kind of experience that came from outliving 3 different rulers and every enemy who had ever underestimated her. Roskin will not stop here, Yara said between clashes, ducking beneath a strike and countering it in one smooth motion. He needs Ashgate destroyed to justify all of this. If he cannot remove you in the halls, he will move against the colony directly to prove his claims true after the fact. Doran said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and he pushed forward with renewed urgency. He was right to worry. Aboard a separate section of the flagship, General Roskin, realizing his coup inside the ship was faltering faster than expected, made a final desperate decision. If he could not remove Doran through rebellion alone, he would force the king's hand by attacking the one thing Doran had proven he valued above tradition itself. Roskin gathered what remained of his loyal soldiers and boarded a shuttle bound for Ashgate's surface, determined to destroy the colony, and with it, any proof that mercy toward humans had been anything but weakness. Below on the ground, the sky above Ashgate turned bright with the descending shapes of Cathari shuttles breaking through the clouds. Captain Cade sounded the alarm the moment he saw them, though he knew, deep down, that 40 soldiers with outdated weapons stood no real chance against a force determined to erase the colony entirely. "Get everyone underground," Cade shouted, soldiers scrambling to guide families toward the shelters dug beneath the colony months earlier, back when the threat of Cathari attack had first become real. Grant grabbed Norah and pulled her toward the shelters as well, his heart pounding, terrified in a way he had never felt even during the king's first arrival weeks earlier. Norah, for the first time, looked frightened too, finally understanding in some small way just how dangerous the world above her truly was. Roskin's shuttle landed hard in the central square, the same square where Doran had once knelt in the rain, and his soldiers spilled out with weapons already raised, moving toward the colony's shelters with brutal efficiency. It was at that exact moment that a second, larger shuttle broke through the clouds and slammed down beside the first, its doors tearing open before it had even fully landed. King Doran Voss stepped out into the square, blood and dust covering his armor, his eyes burning with something colder and more dangerous than anything Roskin's soldiers had ever seen from him. "Stand down," Doran said, his voice carrying across the square with a force that stopped every soldier present in their tracks. "This ends now." Roskin stepped forward from among his men, his own weapon drawn, his expression twisted with the desperation of a man who had already gone too far to turn back. "It ends when the humans are gone, and this empire remembers what strength actually looks like." "You would destroy an entire colony to prove a point," Doran said. "That is not strength. That is fear wearing strength's armor." "Call it what you like," Roskin snarled. "The child dies first. Let the whole Dominion see what your precious debt was truly worth." He turned his weapon toward the shelter entrance, where soldiers had already begun forcing the doors open, dragging terrified colonists back into the square. Norah was pulled out among them, small and shaking, her father fighting uselessly against soldiers twice his size trying to keep her close. King Doran Voss did something then that no Cathari in the history of the Dominion had ever done before. Not for allies, not for family, not even for the crown itself. He walked forward past his own soldiers, past Roskin's raised weapon, and knelt down in the mud of the square in front of Norah Bellwether, bowing his head low before her in full view of every soldier present, human and Cathari alike. "By the old law," Doran said, his voice steady and clear enough for every soldier in the square to hear, "I acknowledge the debt owed to this child, freely given, freely accepted. Let it be known before witnesses. Let it stand forever." A heavy silence fell across the square. Even Roskin's own soldiers lowered their weapons slightly, stunned by the sight of their king bowing not out of weakness, but as the final, unbreakable seal of the oldest law their people had ever known. Roskin's face twisted with fury. "This changes nothing," he shouted, raising his weapon toward Doran's exposed back. Before he could fire, one of his own soldiers stepped forward and struck him down from behind, unable to stand by and watch him defile the sacred law that had just been sworn before them all. Roskin fell into the mud, defeated not by the king's blade, but by the very soldiers who had once followed him. Doran rose slowly, turning to face what remained of Roskin's forces, who lowered their weapons one by one, kneeling not in surrender to death, but in respect for a law older than any war the Dominion had ever fought. The rebellion ended in that square in the rain, exactly where it had all begun. Spring came slowly to Ashgate that year, though it came all the same, softening the gray hills into something almost green and warming the mud that had once run red with rebellion. It had been 6 months since the night General Roskin fell in the colony square, and in that time, more had changed than most of Ashgate's colonists could have ever imagined possible. King Doran Voss had returned to the Dominion's capital after the rebellion's end, but not before making a decision that shocked every corner of Cathari society far more than his kneeling ever had. Colony Ashgate, and by extension all of humanity within reach of Dominion space, was placed formally under the protection of the Cathari crown, an alliance built not on conquest or fear, but on the old law of debt and honor that Doran had sworn before witnesses in the mud of that very square. The decision had not come without resistance. Councillor Yara Set spent weeks defending the alliance before the Dominion's remaining council members, many of whom still struggled to accept that their king had knelt before a human child, and that this single act had somehow reshaped the future of an empire built on strength alone. Slowly, though, resistance gave way to something else. Not full acceptance, not yet, but a grudging curiosity about a species that had earned the loyalty of a king who had never bowed to anyone. Grant Bellwether found himself thrust into a role he had never expected nor particularly wanted. With Ashgate now the first true point of contact between humans and the Cathari Dominion, he was formally named the colony's liaison to the crown, a position that required him to spend long hours negotiating trade agreements, settling misunderstandings between soldiers still uneasy around one another, and occasionally explaining human custom to Cathari officials who found things like birthdays and handshakes endlessly confusing. Captain Cade, for his part, worked closely with the small number of Cathari soldiers now stationed permanently near Ashgate, not as conquerors, but as guards sworn to the colony's protection under Doran's direct order. It was strange, watching soldiers who had once terrified the entire colony now standing shoulder to shoulder with human defenders, though Cade had to admit, after everything that happened, strange wasn't necessarily bad. Norah Bellwether, now closer to 9 than 8, remained mostly unaware of just how large her small act of kindness had grown to become. To her, it had simply been the right thing to do, helping someone who looked hurt and sad, and she found it a little strange that so many adults, human and Cathari alike, treated her like she had done something extraordinary. She still spent her afternoons chasing after Pebble in the tall grass beyond the fence, though now she did so under the watchful eyes of Cathari guards, who took the responsibility far more seriously than she ever expected them to. It was on one such afternoon, with the sun setting gold over the ash-colored hills, that a familiar shuttle descended once again into Ashgate Square, drawing a small crowd of curious colonists who had grown used to Cathari visitors, but never quite used to this particular one. King Doran Voss stepped out into the square, no longer wearing the heavy battle armor of their first meeting, dressed instead in simpler robes that marked him as a king visiting in peace rather than conquest. He looked older somehow, though not weaker, his tiredness replaced by something closer to quiet contentment. Norah spotted him before her father did, abandoning her search for Pebble entirely and running across the square without hesitation, the same fearless energy she had shown that very first day. "You came back," she said, skidding to a stop in front of him. "I did," Doran said, and for the first time, something close to a smile crossed his face. "I wished to see how my debt was faring." "I'm fine," Norah said, rolling her eyes the way only a child could get away with in front of the most powerful being in the star system. "You didn't have to come all this way just for that." "Perhaps not," Doran admitted, "but I wanted to." He knelt down again then, slowly, deliberately, not out of any ancient law or sacred debt this time, but simply to be closer to her eye level, the way one might kneel before a friend rather than a stranger. From within his robes, he produced a small, carefully crafted piece of Kethari armor, no larger than a child's hand, etched with symbols that marked it as belonging to the royal line itself. "This is a token of alliance," he said, placing it gently into her palm. "Between your people and mine. As long as it exists, so too does the peace between us." Norah studied the small piece of armor carefully, turning it over in her hands the same way Doran had once turned over the small cloth she had given him, and smiled. "I'll keep it safe," she said simply. Behind them, Grant watched the exchange with an expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet pride, remembering the terrified man who had once stood in this very square trying to save his colony with careful words, never imagining it would be his daughter's simple kindness that truly saved them all. The dominion that had once ruled through fear now stood beside humanity through something far stronger and far rarer: honor, earned not through conquest, but through the small, unconditioned kindness of a child who had simply seen someone hurting and chosen to help. And in the years that followed, whenever the story of Ashgate was told across both human and Kethari worlds, it was always remembered the same way, not as the tale of a king who ruled through fear, but as the tale of the day he finally learned to kneel.